Her name was Maureen Sullivan. She was 12 years old when the adults around her decided her fate. For months, a man inside her own home had been hurting her. The place that should have protected her became the place where fear lived. She carried that fear to school. She carried it in silence. And when she finally told a teacher, when she finally believed that telling the truth would bring safety, she thought the nightmare would end. It did not end. It changed shape. Within 24 hours, Maureen stood in front of a grey stone building that looked more like a fortress than a refuge. High walls circled it. Broken glass lined the top, glittering like teeth. The windows were narrow. The doors were thick. There were no flowers in the yard, no sound of laughter. Only the scrape of metal as the gates opened. Nuns in black habits met her at the entrance. Their faces were calm, disciplined, unreadable. They did not ask her what had happened at home. They did not ask her what she needed. They took her clothes. They handed her a coarse grey uniform. They sat her in a wooden chair and cut her hair short, the strands falling to the floor like pieces of a life already being erased. They told her she would no longer use her name. Maureen asked when she could go home. No one answered. For the next 4 years, this 12-year-old child scrubbed sheets for up to 14 hours a day without pay. She was not allowed to speak, not allowed to whisper, not allowed to ask questions. And when government inspectors came to check the institution, the nuns hid her in an underground tunnel because a child working as forced labor was difficult to explain. This was not the Middle Ages. This was 1964. The institution where Maureen was confined was called a Magdalene Laundry. The last of these laundries in Ireland closed in 1996. Over nearly 2 centuries, an estimated 30,000 women and girls passed through their doors. What happened inside those walls stands as one of the darkest chapters of modern European history. Everything you are about to hear is grounded in survivor testimony, government inquiries, census data, and official records. There is no exaggeration required. The truth is severe enough. To understand how a child who reported abuse could be punished instead of protected, you must understand the Ireland of that era. Ireland was not merely a Catholic country. The Catholic Church functioned as the central authority of moral and social life. Priests did not only lead Sunday Mass, their opinions shaped reputations. A priest's approval could open doors to employment, housing, respectability. His disapproval could close them just as quickly. Bishops influenced education. Though the state paid teachers, the church controlled curriculum and discipline. Nuns administered hospitals, orphanages, and institutions for those considered socially inconvenient. The boundaries between church and state were thinned to the point of transparency. In that system, a woman's reputation was fragile and unforgiving. Pregnancy outside marriage was treated as proof of moral corruption. Sexual assault was rarely acknowledged as violence against a victim. It was framed as evidence of a girl's own impurity. Orphans were seen as liabilities. Girls labeled difficult or too pretty were considered risks. Beauty suggested temptation. Temptation suggested scandal. And scandal had to be contained. If the church declared a woman guilty, that declaration was often final. No courtroom, no defense, no formal sentence. A priest's word could place a girl behind locked gates. 4 religious orders operated the laundries across Ireland: the Sisters of Mercy, the Sisters of Our Lady of Charity, the Sisters of Charity, and the Good Shepherd Sisters. They divided regions of the country between them. Courts sent women there as informal punishment. Families sent daughters out of shame. Police returned escapees. State agencies referred orphans and girls deemed troublesome. The Irish military and countless businesses sent their laundry to be cleaned. The women inside worked without wages. The institutions generated revenue. Society benefited. Silence protected the arrangement. People often ask how nuns, women devoted to God, could enforce such cruelty. Many of these nuns entered convents as children themselves, some as young as 12 or 13. They were raised inside rigid systems that equated obedience with virtue and suffering with purification. They were taught that certain women were spiritually contaminated. They believed pain could cleanse the soul. They did not necessarily see themselves as villains. They believed they were rescuing sinners from damnation. In that belief, compassion was redefined. Discipline became mercy. Punishment became salvation. True believers can justify almost anything. Maureen's first night inside the laundry altered her understanding of the world. She lay in a dormitory with 30 other women and girls. Beds were placed so close that breathing became communal. Some women cried quietly into thin pillows. Others whispered prayers into darkness. A few stared at the ceiling without expression, their eyes fixed on something no one else could see. There were no mirrors, no calendars, no clocks. Time dissolved. Maureen whispered to the older woman in the next bed, asking how long she had been there. The woman lifted her hands and showed 10 fingers. Then she did it again. And again. 40 years. Her lips formed one word before she turned away forever. The next morning, the bell rang before sunrise. 5 minutes to dress. 5 minutes to make a bed precise enough to avoid reprimand. Then Mass in the chapel, seated behind wooden screens that concealed the women from public view. They were not to be seen. After prayers came the laundry room. Steam filled the air. Machines hissed and clanked. The scent of lye soap burned lungs and eyes. Women scrubbed stained sheets by hand before feeding them into industrial presses, capable of crushing fingers. They lifted wet fabric heavier than their own bodies. They folded linen destined for hotels, hospitals, military barracks, 12 hours, sometimes 14, sometimes longer. Hands cracked and bled. Back stiffened. Chemical burns stung. Work continued. Silence was mandatory. No conversation. No whisper, no humming, only prayer and machinery. Silence not incidental, it was strategic. Women who could not speak could not organize. They could not comfort one another. They could not plan escape. Isolation maintained control. Years of forced, quiet reshaped minds. Some women lost the habit of speech. Others whispered to themselves in corners just to remember their own voices. Even after release, many carried silence with them. Kathleen Lee, one survivor, married and built a family in England. She never told her husband about the laundry. For nearly 4 decades of marriage, the truth remained sealed. Shame had been internalized so completely that confession felt impossible. Maureen remained for 4 years. She entered as a child. She left at 16 with no education, no savings, and scars invisible to anyone who did not know where to look. She was considered fortunate because she left at all. Marina Gamald was 16 when she entered the Good Shepherd convent in New Ross. Orphaned without protection, she was vulnerable by definition. One afternoon, she dropped a cup. It shattered. The supervising nun did not shout. She smiled, retrieved a length of thick string, and tied it loosely around Marina's neck. Not tight enough to strangle, tight enough to remind her of submission with every swallow. For 3 days, Marina wore that string. At meals, she crawled on hands and knees to eat from the floor while others watched in silence. After each meal, she recited a ritual apology, begging divine and communal forgiveness for her bad example. A broken cup warranted humiliation as theology. On another occasion, Marina and 2 girls were locked outside overnight on a glass balcony during winter. No coats, no shoes. Temperatures near freezing. They clung to each other for warmth as frost formed on the glass. 2 nights passed before the door reopened. The 3rd morning, they were told to resume work. Records often describe such injuries as accidents. Survivors remember differently. Kathleen King endured a childhood inside the system under shifting names: Satan, Red Boy, Number 5. The number was inherited from her mother, who had been confined in a mother and baby home and reduced to an alphanumeric code. Identity collapsed into designation. Kathleen recalled being struck repeatedly with a heavy ring of keys. She remembered sitting on a cold metal toilet so long that her skin adhered to it. She remembered a visiting priest noticing bruises and asking questions. Fear prevented honest answers. Truth invited further punishment. Escape attempts were frequent and rarely successful. Women scaled walls, ran through streets, begged strangers for help. Police returned them without inquiry. After recapture, heads were shaved. Hair, one of the last personal symbols, removed. Death statistics reveal the scale of suffering. Researchers have identified approximately 1,900 recorded deaths in Magdalene Laundries, though incomplete documentation suggests the true number is higher. In some institutions, more than half of recorded residents died while confined. At the Good Shepherd Laundry in Limerick between 1961 and 1983, 6 out of 10 women listed in surviving records died inside. At High Park in Dublin, more than half recorded between 1954 and 1964 never left alive. Census comparisons uncovered cases of women confined between 11 and 74 years. 74 years of labor without compensation. 74 years of regulated silence. When women died, burials were often unmarked. Families were not always notified. Death certificates were incomplete or absent. In 1993, land owned by the Sisters of Our Lady of Charity in Dublin's Drumcondra was slated for sale after financial losses. Before development, bodies from the convent cemetery required exhumation. Permission was requested to relocate 133 remains. Workers discovered 155 bodies. Documentation existed for only a portion. Later investigations suggested at least 15 deaths at that location alone. Many exhumed red bones set in plaster casts, indicating serious injuries. Official explanations cited falls or accidents. Survivors described beatings and hazardous working conditions. The 155 exhumed bodies were cremated. Ashes were combined and placed in a mass grave at Glasnevin Cemetery. The event ignited public outrage and international attention. In 2013, the Irish government issued a formal apology. The Prime Minister acknowledged state responsibility and the profound failure to protect vulnerable women. Compensation funds were established. By 2022, over 800 survivors had received payments totaling approximately €33 million. The religious orders, collectively holding significant property assets, declined to contribute financially to the compensation scheme. Statements expressed regret for historical circumstances but avoided direct accountability. The final Magdalene Laundry closed on October 25, 1996. By then, the internet was expanding globally. Modern Ireland was presenting itself as progressive and economically rising. Yet within city limits, women were still laboring in silence under religious authority. Approximately 30,000 women passed through these institutions over nearly 2 centuries. By the mid-20th century, roughly 1 in 100 people in Ireland was confined in some form of religious-run institution. Maureen Sullivan refused to let the story dissolve. As an adult, she sought out other survivors. She recorded testimonies. She pressed for investigation. She advocated for memorialization of unmarked graves. She rejected the idea that their suffering should remain footnotes. "I don't believe in unmarked graves for survivors," she said. "We were treated like nobodies. I won't let us be buried like nobodies." Today, some former laundry buildings stand abandoned, windows broken, walls crumbling. Others have been converted into residential apartments. New tenants walk corridors unaware of the labor and grief embedded in the stone. For survivors, no apology restores lost childhoods, no financial settlement compensates for decades of unpaid work, broken bones, or stolen identities. The trauma reverberated through marriages, parenting, and silence that lasted generations. The Magdalene Laundries were not medieval relics. They were modern institutions sustained by cultural belief, economic incentive, and collective denial. They remind us that systems of abuse do not require monsters. They require ordinary people convinced that obedience is virtue and that suffering purifies. Maureen Sullivan entered through iron gates as a child seeking protection. She emerged determined that what happened inside those walls would be recorded, spoken, and remembered. History does not disappear because it is uncomfortable. It waits beneath foundations, in census ledgers, in unnamed graves, until someone insists on uncovering it. The gates are open now, the walls remain. The silence has finally begun to break.